Gilles Deleuze said that the third chapter of Difference and Repetition, called The Image of Thought, was the most important chapter of the book. Why is that? I'm philosophy professor and podcaster Ellie Anderson, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about some of the ideas from this chapter. Of course, as with any video introducing a work of philosophy, this video is by no means going to do justice to all of the ideas developed in this chapter, which, as with a lot of Deleuze's work, is just really packed with creative, explosive ideas, we might say. But my hope is that this can provide an introduction or an invitation to read the text on your own, because Deleuze can be quite challenging to read on your own. Deleuze is deeply concerned that the way we usually think about thinking throughout the entire history of philosophy is misguided. He says that philosophy prides itself on being the discipline that gets rid of presuppositions. The whole point of the beginning of philosophy, to really start out, is to get rid of any presuppositions, any assumptions that we have, and start from a clear slate or a blank ground, we might say. And you really see this if you open the first page of a lot of the most famous works in the history of Western philosophy. You're going to notice Aristotle's Metaphysics is a place that Deleuze calls out on this. So is Descartes' Meditations and Kant's First Critique. What you see in these texts, Deleuze says, from the very beginning, is an assumption that there is such a thing as knowledge, and that everyone is naturally geared to be able to find it. And so philosophy is about this pursuit of knowledge or of truth, or to use the etymology of philosophy, of wisdom, right? It's involved in the pursuit of wisdom. And we all tend to think that our natural faculty for thinking can help us get there. For Deleuze, however, this idea, which is really the beginning of philosophy in much of the history of philosophy, is actually itself indicative of a presupposition that philosophy has been unable to eliminate. And that is what he calls a subjective presupposition of thought, which is the dogmatic image. According to Deleuze, what's going on in all of these beginnings of philosophy that take themselves to be removing all presuppositions is the presupposition that we have this naturally endowed faculty of thinking for gaining truth, and that common sense and good sense are the way to get there. The statement everybody knows, according to Deleuze, is symptomatic of what he calls the image of thought, or the dogmatic image. And so the main project of this chapter of Difference and Repetition is to uncover the image of thought and to show its limitations. What is going on when philosophy is engaging in this presupposition, assuming that it's already there, not subjecting it to radical critique? Deleuze's project is ultimately to destroy, to overturn the image of thought, because he thinks it distorts thinking. And we need to start from a radically different place if we are actually going to be able to understand thinking on its own terms, or ultimately, given the context of the rest of this book, Difference and Repetition, to understand difference in itself and repetition for itself. The basic idea with the image of thought is that it subjects thought to representation. It treats our experience of the world as amenable to representation, and specifically to the representation of a thinker, a cogito in Descartes' term, a subject. Representation is pretty much always a problem for Deleuze because it radically reduces difference, treating everything according to the categories of substance or the same, which you see reappear over the course of the history of philosophy. And so he's inspired by Nietzsche to have this radical break and to think about thought as a productive and creative faculty rather than something that recognizes what is out there in the world according to representations. Deleuze says that the I think is the most general principle of representation because it treats the cogito as the unifier of experience or of all of the faculties. So for instance, if I see a water glass, if I perceive this with my sense of perception, my faculty of perception, then I can close my eyes and suddenly imagine the water glass. I'm now seeing it in my imagination. And I presume that the water glass that I'm seeing and the one that I'm imagining are exactly the same because they are the same object. They're just objects that are translated between different faculties. What allows me to recognize that the water glass that I see and the water glass that I imagine are the same thing? Well, it is the subject, specifically the thinking subject, the cogito. The cogito, Deleuze says, is the philosophical version of common sense, by which he doesn't mean common sense economics or something like that. He means a sense in common, a fundamental unifying sense that's going to be able to translate between all of the different faculties, between perception, imagination, judgment, cognition, etc. One of the weird things about this chapter is that Deleuze ends the chapter by listing 8 postulates of the dogmatic image. But when you actually are reading the chapter, it's not really clear at all that he is developing 8 different postulates, each of which has 2 forms. Instead, you're just like reading the chapter, and then suddenly he says, then there's this 5th postulate. And you might be thinking, well, what were the first 4 postulates? When I teach this text, I encourage my students to read the last page of the text at the beginning, or the last page of the chapter at the beginning, if you want a more schematic notion of what's going on. Now, I have to say that I find the list of the 8 propositions, or the 8 postulates at the end of the chapter to be useful, but in a sort of limited way. I don't think that you can give a TLDR version of Deleuze that is going to be satisfying, which is again why I started this video with a caveat. I don't take myself to be giving a TLDR version of Deleuze, because you really have to have what he calls an encounter with him. And I think this goes for really all philosophers. But Deleuze is pretty explicit about it. And so I do think that reading the chapter on its own, you can get into the rhythm of what he's saying and really have a lot of things stand out for you that might not be encapsulated through these 8 postulates. At the same time, it can be helpful as a handhold, as with something like this video, because as I said earlier, Deleuze is quite challenging to understand as a first reader, especially if you're not doing so within the context of a class that's being guided by a professor with expertise in the subject. So I'm not going to go ahead and list those 8 postulates, but I want to just mention that they're there. A lot of what I'm talking about in this video relates to them and is drawing on some of the ideas that are involved in the postulates that he lays out at the end. I mentioned that key to the image of thought is the notion of the cogito, or the subject, as the unifier of experience across different faculties. Deleuze's response to this is actually that faculties don't need, and actually shouldn't have, a principle of unification. They rather have discordance between them. This discordance between the faculties is echoed in Deleuze's concept of intensity, which he says is pure difference in itself. He says that the faculties are different by virtue of having free and untamed states of difference in themselves, such that an intensity reaches its limit, and that's where the faculty stops, like say the faculty of sensibility, and a different faculty, say that of imagination, begins. Deleuze says that faculties are not related by means of mediation or representation. Pretty much anytime you see the words mediation and representation in a Deleuze text, that's going to be a signal that he's describing a view that he does not buy. This doesn't mean, however, that the faculties are all just like these completely separate tracks, because again, he wants to get us out of substance thinking, which is why he introduces the idea of intensities. And so this also means that the, quote, object of a faculty is not going to be an object in the way that we usually think about it. Really what it's going to be is what Deleuze calls the idea, or the problem. He wants to get away from a notion of knowledge as a correspondence between an external world and a mental judgment, or a belief in a state of affairs, and towards an idea of problems as being the basis for truth, and toward an idea of problems as being where truth and falsity find their home. He's resolutely against the idea that truth and falsity can be encapsulated in propositions. He takes issue with Frege's notion of denotation versus expression in this chapter, and this chapter actually just has a lot in general that could really be seen as a critique of what's known today as analytic philosophy. For Deleuze, problems or ideas are creative, and they're not the creation of a particular individual subject, but rather they are things that strike us as if from the outside, even though we can't actually say they're from the outside, by means of intensity. Even though he takes issue with Kant to some degree in this chapter, he does think that this notion that there is a discordance between the faculties, even as there is a harmony between them by virtue of the idea, one can find in Kant. And he uses the example of the relation between imagination and thought in Kant's theory of the sublime. So he says, for instance, on page 146, there is therefore something which is communicated from one faculty to another, but it is metamorphosed and does not form a common sense. One of the funny things about this chapter actually is the retrieval of what's known as faculties, or I would say faculty psychology, given that's what we call it in the tradition of philosophy, but I don't actually know if Deleuze would buy that term faculty psychology. But the faculties, or this notion that the mind is endowed with different capabilities that usually include a list like imagination, perception, memory, thought, judgment, etc. You find this in Kant, but in other places as well, has been pretty unpopular in 20th century philosophy, actually even philosophy post-Hegel in the 19th century. And Deleuze says that, no, I'm really trying to retrieve this notion of the faculties, but to rewrite it in a different way. So it's not that the faculties are faculties of a thinking subject, but rather that they express limits and intensities and lead us to a radically different ontology that's not a substance-based ontology theory of being. Going back briefly to that quote from 146, the something that is communicated from one faculty to another is what Deleuze calls the idea. So that's Deleuze's approach to the faculties in this chapter. Another target for Deleuze in this chapter on the image of thought, in addition to the traditional notion of the cogito and the way that the faculties are conceived of in that schema, is that of representation, which I've talked about a little bit before. And he sees representation as involving four basic aspects. And these are aspects of the medium of representation, which he takes to be reason. The first is identity. The second is analogy, the third is opposition, and the fourth is resemblance. Deleuze thinks that these four aspects are ways that we are encouraged and have been encouraged, at least since Aristotle, to conceive of the world as a set of delimited objects that are related to one another in various ways, right? They're related by means of analogy, opposition, resemblance, or, oh God, what was the fourth one? Identity, of course. So, maybe the most important one, in fact. And in this chapter, he says that those four notions, those four aspects to reason as the medium of representation, fundamentally prevent us from understanding difference in itself. They operate based on a logic of recognition, traditionally in the history of philosophy. And his account of recognition is super interesting in this chapter, much more complicated than I'll have time to canvas here. But more or less, the idea is that when I was using that example of the water glass a few minutes ago, what I'm doing when I close my eyes and imagine the water glass is recognize that that water glass in my mind is the same as the water glass in real life. So there's that element of recognition that involves a translation between the different faculties. But I would also say that there's a different notion of recognition that Deleuze has in mind in this chapter as well, which is the idea of recognition as it has played into theories of knowledge, at least since Plato, for instance, the Meno, but also the Theaetetus and some other Platonic dialogues. And that is the idea that when we come to know something, it's not as if something radically new is entering our mind. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to recognize that new thing as true. Instead, what's happening is precisely recognition, so that a new piece of knowledge that is entering our minds is actually something that we, in a sense, implicitly already had a notion of. This is the recognition model of knowledge. And Deleuze thinks that this model is highly problematic because, for one, he says that it's modeled on empirical observations in a way that doesn't actually rise to the level of transcendental analysis. So it claims to be universal, but it's in fact not. But in addition to that, it's socially and politically quite dangerous because it makes it seem like there's no creation of new values that can arise. It condemns us to just a recognition of what is already out there. It has no space for the novel, for the inventive, for the creative. So again, there's this Nietzschean dimension of Deleuze that is trying to spring forth, that he thinks that the recognition model just cannot accommodate. Thinking for Deleuze is not a matter of recognizing something and having that recognition of something turn into knowledge or turn into error, but rather is, as he says on page 139, trespass and violence. Thinking for Deleuze is creative. When we recognize something, Deleuze thinks, we're actually not thinking. So he finds it very weird that the history of philosophy treats thinking and knowledge as forms of recognition, when in fact he thinks that these are opposed to it. Recognition is this shallow, just like, oh, seen that in some sense before. type of operation. Whereas thought is genuinely creative, and it involves an object of an encounter. So the encounter is a term that Deleuze will use to designate the novel, the creative, the inventive, as opposed to what is just an object of recognition. He says that the object of an encounter can only be sensed. We sense this object, and it forces us to think. There's a lot of language of force in this chapter. For Deleuze, the creative act of thinking, joyful and affirmative as it may be, is actually a cruel act of violence as well. He thinks that the object of sensation moves the soul and forces us to pose a problem. I said toward the beginning of the video that Deleuze is trying to resist that dogmatic image of thought that we see at the very beginning of many philosophy texts that suggests that all people by nature want to know and that we have a good sense that we are naturally endowed with. He thinks that related to that image of thought is the notion that error is the only possible misadventure of thought. Now, historically, within philosophy, error is seen as a lack or a privation, a negation of knowledge. It's often associated even with sin in the medieval period. And Deleuze is trying to move away from the idea that thinking is naturally good, right, on the right track, and the only way that it can be waylaid is by something intruding from outside of it, something that is not it, right? According to this view, thought itself doesn't have any problems. It's just that a lack of thought, perhaps by the intrusion of something from outside, is going to cause problems for it, right? And so this is the way that we fall into untruth, is by means of error, where error is seen as extrinsic to thought and as a lack of or negation of thought. Because Deleuze is trying to move away from the image of thought to explode it, he wants to think about other misadventures of thought that are not encapsulated by error, because he does not think that error is the true and only misadventure of thought. He says a number of things in this chapter. He talks a little bit about madness and malevolence, which he says, yeah, the image of thought recognizes, but it sees these as just empirical problems. It doesn't really have a strong analysis of them. But the main misadventure of thought on which he wants to focus, which he sees as actually indicative not of the image of thought, but more of the philosophy of difference that he's trying to espouse, is that of stupidity, which in French is bêtise. Now, bêtise has the word bête within it, which means animal in French. Deleuze also notes that bêtise is not the same as animality, but which is, I think, probably why the translator translates it as stupidity in the English, in addition to the fact that it's just like actually the word that they use for stupidity. So it's perhaps not a controversial translation to put it in these terms. But I think it's worth keeping in mind for those of us who are English readers that bêtise does have the word animal within it. And this is going to become important for some of the stuff that Deleuze talks about in this chapter, as well as for his later work, where he's really interested in the notion of becoming animal. For Deleuze, stupidity is what he calls the faculty for false problems. Stupidity is the evidence of an inability to constitute, comprehend, or determine a problem as such. And he says that, in fact, teachers are much more familiar with nonsense than they are with errors, right? When you receive an essay that's bad, it's more likely that it's going to be bad because it doesn't make a lot of sense than that it's going to be rife with errors. And so Deleuze says we need to take this actually very seriously within philosophy, and to have an account of the faculty for false problems, which he calls stupidity, and which he links with nonsense. Although there's quite a longer story to tell about nonsense that I'm not going to be able to do justice at all to here. He thinks that stupidity is possible because of the link between thought and individuation. Even though Deleuze is trying to move away from the notion of the subjective I or the cogito, he does talk a lot about individuation in this book. And he thinks that the link between thought and individuation is a lot more profound than what appears in the I think. He says on page 151 that this link is established in a field of intensity that actually constitutes the sensibility already of the thinking subject. Individuation, he says here, this is a bit of a mouthful quote, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. On page 152, involves fields of fluid intensive factors, which no more take the form of an I than a self. Individuation as such, as it operates beneath all forms, is inseparable from a pure ground that it brings to the surface and trails with it. In saying that stupidity involves the relation between individuation and thought, Deleuze is saying that individuation brings the ground to the surface without being able to give it a form. Hence, we get this faculty for false problems, like the false problems just arise. And so in contrasting thought and stupidity, and problems and stupidity, Deleuze is trying to offer a different articulation of the way that thought can get waylaid or can be misguided, that does not depend on the negation or privation of error. And this links up with his broader project, Indifference and Repetition, which is to offer an account of difference in itself that doesn't reduce difference to negation. I hope this has provided at least some helpful context and an invitation, as I mentioned earlier, into this text. Check it out.